Hello, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on the Gerhard Center webinar series session, The Aftermath of the COVID-19, the New Social Impact Ecosystem. My name is Ali Aouni. I'm with the Gerhard Center. We've launched the series in April, almost 2 months ago, with the aim of discussing concepts that are currently not mainstream and may or perhaps should become mainstream in the aftermath of COVID-19. Today is the 15th session, and it's a pleasure to have with us Daria Ofman. She's a global consulting with Better Future, a purpose-driven consultancy operating from the Netherlands that supports companies and NGOs with their impact strategy and implementation. The title of her talk is Responsible Business, Shifts and Trends in the Wake of the COVID-19. At Better Future, Daria designs and facilitates strategic change processes, retreats, and learning journeys for purpose-driven leaders and organizations all over the world. She worked in Egypt and the Middle East for 6 years, supporting civil society organizations, startups, and small and medium businesses in their leadership, effective, and growth, providing technical training, lead grants, team development, and gaining access to investment. Before that, she was an advisor to public sector in the Netherlands, having done projects for the parliament, many ministries, and educational institutions on dialogue and co-creation processes, research, strategic policy assessment, and facilitating think tank sessions. In Egypt, she was connected with the Middle East Council for Small Business and Entrepreneurship and the ILO. She was working with entrepreneurship and startup companies to make the leap into the unknown and find their feet to growth. Now, the plan, Daria is going to have 25 to 30 minutes of a presentation. Then we're going to have 25 minutes of Q&A. The questions you're going to send via the chat box. So without much ado, Daria, it's a pleasure to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ali, and thank you for inviting me for this this talk. I'm really quite excited to do this with the AUC, and I mean, Egypt has a very special place in my heart. Having lived there for 6 years, I just returned just over 2 years ago back to the Netherlands, joining Better Future, which I think for me was quite a logical step. And so today will mainly be about talking from my experience and our experience dealing with supporting companies and NGOs to become more financially sustainable within a purpose frame. So really learning how to balance purpose and profit. And what I like about the framing of the series of webinars that you do is that you're really looking at, you know, the models that might not yet be mainstream, but maybe should become that. And those are exactly the companies that we are working with. And we have a very international focus. Before COVID, most of my work actually took place in Africa, which now has halted a bit, or we're like this talk, we're doing a lot online. But I'll take you a little bit through how we work and what we try to achieve. And there are also a couple of questions to the audience, because I would love to know who we have here today with us. Maybe also good to know is that I'm not a scientist. I'm really speaking more from a practitioner's perspective. I know that you've had a lot of scientific people in these webinars. So, I mean, some of the things I'm saying are, you know, partially derived from scientific literature, but the majority is really from practice and the observations that we have working with our clients. So very quickly, our company is called Better Future. I think it points to the direction that we're aiming at. And our reason for existing is that we humanize organizations to turn businesses in a force for good. Because I think one of the premises for us is that in the end, all businesses should have a social responsibility for society, and that it is actually quite strange that there are still businesses that don't ask themselves the question, why do we exist? And what we do is that we guide companies or NGOs towards more impact for their strategy. We always look at what is better for the world, what is good for business, and what is life-changing for the people in it. Because the most innovative thing of any organization is like an alive human being that knows how to shift with the currents that they're presented with. And the classic journeys that we do, and also how we were founded in 2003, that's quite a long time ago, is that we connect corporates with NGOs or social enterprises. Why? Because I think a lot of, let's say, larger corporates have really lost why they exist. But when you work with a purpose-driven impact entrepreneur or an NGO that really knows why they exist, connecting those teams together, supporting the NGO with the technical business and process know-how that corporates are really great at, getting first-class consultancy for how to structure their business or how to scale. And for a corporate team, usually it's a leadership team or it's preferably a leadership board, to work with an impact organization. That change process that this corporate will go through, the impact that that has by working together with an NGO in Lebanon or in Kenya or in whatever company we can or organization we connect them with, the impact that has on senior leadership is larger than any change process you can ever achieve, in a hotel room in the Netherlands, not very far from here. So that's the basic idea. Just quickly where we're coming from in terms of intention, we are quite radical in how we approach our clients. I have the incredible privilege to work with some of the coolest businesses out there that really dare to do things really differently, which for me has been quite a steep learning curve in the last 2 years, coming back from Egypt to see, whoa, there are really companies out there that are operating in a really different context and can also afford to take a huge risk, because culture and context matters for the success of these businesses. And that's why I really care doing this also with an Egyptian audience, because there are so many lessons coming from East Africa to Southeast Asia that are really relevant to Egypt. Now, for what today is about, I think, let's say, start here. So I would like to start with a quick section about framing and communication, and to look at maybe more the marketing side of responsible business. We're all familiar with the flashy headlines and marketing slogans that we see, or purpose statements that are out there. And I think it's relevant to at least acknowledge that that is a reality, and that it sometimes is clouding what is really going on the ground. And just to say a bit about my background, I have my academic training has been in international law, and I focused my master thesis on the humanizing language of international law, and also how deceptive that can be, because what we've seen in the last 10 years is that for any international bill to pass, it needs to speak humanitarian or human rights language in order to be accepted. But the power dynamics behind that have not changed. So in that, I think that reality you can actually transfer to business as well, is that it is really important to know, when you see cool marketing language, what is real and what is just fluffed up. Because there's a lot of fluff in this sector, and it's important to acknowledge that, to also see what is really real. I hope that makes sense, but we'll go through that in a bit, because I I selected some marketing language for you to see if you can distinguish what is real and what is more created by a smart marketing department. To understand what we mean by responsible business, because it's quite a broad term, I don't want to have a large discussion about definitions, social business, responsible business, but it's quite a broad scala of enterprises. Have a quick look at the different types of social enterprises or responsible businesses and why that is relevant, and also look at the difference between being market-based and being financially profitable, which has a lot to do about the profit expectations that we have. And then I'll look more into the trends that we see happening, well, now being accelerated or hindered by COVID, but also stuff that has been going on for quite a while. And then, yeah, maybe look at more the specific aspects that are changing because of COVID that we see happening. But before that, I would love to ask the audience a question. If you go to a website called menti.com, I would like to invite you all to go to that website, and once you arrive to that website, they ask you for a code, and if you fill in that code, they will ask you 3 questions, and then we'll have a look who we have in the room, because I'm looking at a screen, but I can't see you, but I'd love to hear more about who exactly we have today. So I will stop sharing my screen, and we will go to the menti.com and see who we have. Nee. Let's see. I will share my screen again and see. I already see some answers coming in. There we are. That is great. So the cities that you're calling in, I was curious, are we only talking to people in Cairo? I greatly doubt it. And I think this is a confirmation. That's really nice. Abu Dhabi, Johannesburg, Amsterdam, Prague, Egypt. That's really cool. Houston. Very nice. We have a lot of continents represented. Thanks for doing that. Cool. In Riyadh, great. All right. I'm sure there are more, but this already gives me an understanding of where you're all coming from. If you go to the next question. Let's see. The industry or sector that you work in, I'd be happy to know, are you coming from a more academic background or practitioner's perspective, impact investment, higher education, youth work? That's nice. Yeah. Consultancy, civil society. Okay, great. Consulting, yeah. Even more civil society. The larger words have more, have more people behind them. Okay, great. And then for the last question is, and this refers also for me, so I know in the presentation what to highlight and what to give more emphasis, is that what is your takeout wish for this webinar? What do you wish to learn, or why are you basically here? Because you decided to spend 1 hour on this topic. This might take a little bit inspiration, but that's great. See, yeah, learning more. Well, that's an easy one probably to fulfill. Better ways to look at business. Yes, I will make sure to address that. Yeah, so understanding the future of CSR, that's a very good question as well. I have a strong opinion about that. Understanding the new norm and the effect of COVID on businesses and civil society. Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I'm sorry to cut off people that haven't written yet, but I will continue. I'll go back to the main presentation. Yeah. There we are. Great. So thanks for sharing this. This really helps me to focus on certain points and leave other points maybe a bit out. So coming back to what today is about, starting with framing and communication. And I do really think that it's important. And for that, I have a couple of questions to you. And I would like to ask you, to look at the following purpose statements that I put on, and just to think about how believable do you think that they are. And I have to say that half of these are our clients and half of them are other companies that I did find interesting. And so the question is, which one do you think is the most believable and which is the least believable? And when you also see the title of the company with it, because it's also always important to look at who is saying it. And maybe a bit more context, Tony Chocolonely is a Dutch cocoa company that sells chocolate. Ecom Ghana is a cocoa trader, and they are also one of the larger traders in East and West Africa, so doing coffee and cotton. Friesland Campina is actually a corporate co-op, but they also have an office in Egypt. And Vattenfall, the electricity energy company. And the Vegetarian Butcher is an interesting upcoming business that is trying to move beyond a meat-based, to make us stop eating meat, basically. So curious, maybe you can write in the chat the most believable and the least believable, and Kariman, if you could highlight one or two of them, because there's an idea behind asking this. Maybe you can just tell me one or two, otherwise I will.
We actually have received one, Tony's Chocolonely. I guess this is the most believable.
Okay.
We haven't received others yet.
All right. Okay. Well, maybe you can interrupt me once you get them.
Sure, do that.
So why this is relevant is, so when you look at purpose statements, I think this might be an interesting framework to consider, which is really that I always look at, does a company dare to make a claim? Do they dare to speak with dedication and urgency? Because it's really easy and it's very safe to make a statement. And also promises, it kind of depends on how vague they remain. So just going back quickly.
Daria, let me interrupt you.
Yeah?
We got one, Vegetarian Butcher is the most believable.
Okay. Yeah.
To confirm it.
Great. So just to touch on those, is I think what's interesting about Tony's statement is that they say slave-free chocolate as a standard in the chocolate industry. Like, they were established not to sell chocolate, but to make sure that the entire sector becomes slave-free. And once they have accomplished that mission, they say we'll close the business. We've mission accomplished. Don't know if they will do that, but that's the idea. And for the Vegetarian Butcher, what is interesting is the part without concessions. That we will move toward a plant-based food chain without concessions. And this already points to the purpose of these statements usually is not even for the outside. In my experience working with these companies, what it really does, if you have a sharp purpose statement, it helps people internally to create leverage to address incongruencies. So I think, for instance, the example of Vattenfall is also quite interesting, unexpected from them. If they don't achieve becoming fossil-free within one generation, they need to have a really good discussion, because that is pretty measurable and that is pretty fast. So that is a very daring claim to make. Whereas when you say we enlighten daily moments for everybody, what does that mean? There's nothing to hold anybody accountable over. So that's the accountability part is always interesting. Like, is there something you can hold somebody accountable for? Because if they do that, it means that they really thought about what this means. So that's just a framework to help maybe look through what is real and what is marketing. Now moving on to the next part and what we mean by a responsible business, because like I said, it's useless to have a conversation about definitions, or not useless, but maybe for a different moment. I think what is one of the most interesting pieces of research that helped me in consulting and to point out to businesses that I work with is this framework. It is taken from a paper by Boston Consulting Group. It's a bit dated, 2013. but it's still really relevant and clear to me because it shows that we're dealing with a spectrum. We're dealing with a spectrum literally from, an NGO that is entirely donor-driven towards a very commercial business that maximizes profit for shareholders. And what we are looking at, or what I will be looking at today, is really this field primarily. So the intersection between a pure social business that might have been established to address a social problem, or maybe a corporate that has moved, or a larger SME that has moved towards becoming more responsible because, well, several reasons. I'll come back to this because it's a bit relevant, and I'll also touch a little bit on the NGOs that are commercializing and becoming social enterprises, because speaking of trends, that's, I think, a massive one. Now, what about those companies now that move from maybe being a little bit more of a traditional business towards a responsible business? What are the reasons for them to do that? I think for us, because they are our clients primarily, I think that one of the main reasons is that they address a social or climate cause, that they feel like, okay, we have a responsibility that is important to address, and we feel that responsibility. Sometimes, to be honest, quite often, it's a sense of personal legacy from a CEO or somebody in the leadership board that really believes, I have a responsibility for the next generations after me. And those are great to work with, because change processes like this, if you don't start them in the board, you're wasting your time. It really doesn't help to start somewhere in middle management, because you're talking about massive strategic decisions. This is also a nice one, becoming future-proof. People understand different things about it, but I think the core is to be able to address market issues that are upcoming and to be able to respond to them adequately. And an interesting observation is that BlackRock, which is maybe one of the more mainstream investors that every year publishes this paper about the trends they see in investment. They're not an impact investor. 2 years ago, they said that it's important to have a clear purpose. And last year, 2019, they said it's your license to operate. If you don't have a clear purpose, you basically lose the legitimacy to exist. Well, that coming from a mainstream investor, I think, was quite interesting. And this is a reason that a lot of companies are like, we have to do something with this. We don't know how, but we need to. Another important one is wanting to work more efficiently, which is a great cause because it affects the core of your business, and wanting a clear focus and direction. Because if you have a clear social cause, it helps you in strategic decision making. And in this fluid world that we're in, that is worth a lot, to really be clear on what are you for and what are you not for. And well, last but not least, I know this is in Europe a huge issue. I also know, I mean, from what I hear from like even the social entrepreneurship sector in East Africa, retaining talented youth, if you want to make sure that you offer a competitive working environment, you need to have a clear purpose. Because if you can choose as a talented young person between several corporates of whom, a few really don't have a purpose, then the choice is easily made. And this will increase in the future even faster. There's a lot of research about millennials and what they find important, but we feel this very well on a daily basis. Now, from the other side, I want to quickly touch on this because it is relevant, I think. It's that why are NGOs also becoming social enterprises, or partially? And because this is, I mean, in my experience, because I do a lot of work with NGOs, and I think at this moment that there's hardly any larger, especially international NGO, that is not thinking about how to at least partially, create revenue from their services or products. And that has to do partially with that they want to become more independent from donor funding, because you can't structurally fund overhead for a start. but you're also less flexible to address local needs because you're dealing with donor agendas. Another thing, especially in upcoming markets, I do a lot of work in Kenya, and it's really interesting to see how booming the entire social responsible sector is there, because the technical abilities to suddenly work with people that used to be nomads, that all have a smartphone and with a mobile credit wallet, their M-Pesa system, have access to legal services, agricultural services, educational services. These people used to be beneficiaries of traditional NGOs, but suddenly they are potential clients. And that opens up a massive market for new business models. Some of them are a bit questionable, but that's different. Then another part is the government policy and legislative restrictions that a lot of countries put on NGOs, which they have to do with different reasons. The administrative burden might be very large because of the good governance that we expect from NGOs. The administrative hassle thereby is too large. But I think also a lot of countries, I think Egypt is a very large example of that, is that too often civil organizations have been conflated with rights-based organizations, and therefore it's just really hard to operate. And it's much safer for them to operate as a for-profit business. It's less transparent, but that's a different story. So you see this in China as well, that NGOs that are not operating under a for-profit model, it's just not safe for them. This is also an important one for the organizations we work with in Southeast Asia, are really complaining all the money suddenly is going to the Middle East and Africa for reasons of migration and youth employment, entrepreneurship, and that is a reality, that donor interests are shifting. So that is just about the NGO side of the story, and that has to do with the fact that we need to have a clear expectation of what is the difference between being market-based and being financially profitable. Because I sometimes get the sense that we have inflated expectations of what social enterprises are supposed to do. And it's just not, the expectations is just not realistic that they will be incredibly profitable within a short period of time. And that is fine, because we're talking about healthy growth. We're not talking about endless growth. So that is specifically relevant for enterprises that are operating in certain sectors. And, sorry, my mouse is, And that's why I wanted to touch on the types of social enterprises that we see. Loosely speaking, you can kind of categorize them in either improving the supply chain. Those are companies that might be, let me see. Companies that might be a cocoa trader that is actually paying a true price for their product. Creating circularity might be more of the greener companies that are working on sustainability, energy sufficiency, or an agri-business that is using circular practices. And you also have companies that are primarily looking at fighting social inequality. For instance, that are employing people that have, with a distance to the labor market, youth or refugees, people with like autism. And you see that these type of companies, the moment they start to scale, their ability to generate financial growth is also impeded because of the model that they have. So, for the other, let's say, the improving the supply chain and creating circularity, these two sectors, there doesn't necessarily have to be a tension between financial growth and their reason for existing. But for the ones that are really there to fight a social inequality, there often is a tension between financial growth and their objective. And for those, a steep financial growth is just not realistic, and that's totally fine. Therefore, when you look at businesses, it's just really good to understand what sector are you looking at. Now, the next part, and then I hope to get to the larger trends that we see. I've divided them into macro trends and micro trends. So the macro trends are, let's say, the more abstract, and then the micro trends will get into specific company cases. Overall, I think what's happening now and what is really accelerated through by COVID is that we see that there's a shift from shareholder to stakeholder. And I think that's a good idea, because even 20 years ago, I think it was Jack Welch, the ex-CEO of General Electric, said that shareholder maximization is the dumbest idea ever. And I really like that statement, because it is true when you think about social impact. And nowadays, you see that a lot of, especially larger companies, are challenged how to make that transition from shareholder to stakeholder. And because that requires a much more holistic type of leadership than focusing mainly on shareholder value, because that's a relatively simple way to manage. And there was a study by Deloitte in 2018, and they asked the top 15 listed companies in the US about the difference between what is important in the upcoming period and how ready are you to address it. And you saw that the C-suite leadership was really, there was a huge discrepancy between what they thought is important and what they were able to address. And that is what we see with our clients, is that we all know what is important, but we're not ready to address it, because in a shareholder model, it is very difficult to realize. So I think a metaphor that might help to understand, and I usually point this out when I work with companies that are in this phase, is that there are still people that believe that the world looks like this, that we are operating in an agricultural landscape where everybody has their own field and their own plow, and you know exactly how much labor leads to what outcome. And it's a pretty predictable and comprehensible world there. And you know exactly how much output you should be generating. But when you think about it, this is quite an artificial way of looking at business. And a little bit more historically, our business landscape, or let's say that the business landscape that we have now, was created after the Second World War, in a period where the US dominated the landscape. So we created a system where there's one country that kind of sets the rules, and where a lot of the leadership and business literature that we still have until now is based on that time period. Now, when you look at the world now, this is what we see. We see a unipolar world where there are many power forces in the world. There are many strong markets that are competing and collaborating, but you need completely different business language and mechanisms in order to survive there. Because in a jungle, you can virtually work yourself off the edge of a cliff, and it's not sufficient to survive. And therefore, you need other business tools and mechanisms. And you see that the shareholder model is really not equipped to deal with this world. Definitely not in a responsible way. And that's definitely now what COVID has shown us, is that this world does no longer exist. This is where we're now. And that requires a different type of leadership. So I think it's a really cool way to be a cool time to be in business right now, to work in this landscape. And it does pose a couple of interesting other trends that are derived from this transition. And one of them is that we need new career incentives. And we need a different way of rewarding people. It needs to be much more tailored, much more holistic, much more focusing on not necessarily upward mobility, but sometimes more vertical change. So because the centers of let's say what a marketeer was supposed to do 5 years ago is not what a marketeer should be doing now. The requirements for these jobs are changing so fast that the promise and the incentives need to change according to how rapid change is happening in these sectors. And another trend that I see a lot is that a lot of corporates are delayering, so they're becoming more flat. And that is something like if you do that, you need to manage the expectations of your people, because if you hire people because they want to become a manager in 5 years, they are in for a disappointment. So you need to find other ways to incentivize and to reward people, and they're not harmonized. Like, you need to diversify that much more. And the companies that are growing really fast are managing to do that. And that has to do with the changing value of hierarchy. Like I said before, I think hierarchy is really overrated in a diffuse shareholder model where there's so many societal factors that you need to take into consideration. And what's interesting is that even in countries that we work in that are quite hierarchical by nature, for instance, I think Kenya is, well, one of them that I have worked myself in a lot, is that all the social enterprises that I work with, small and large, are really quite flat in their approach. I even saw this in Egypt in quite a lot of social enterprises, that there is limited hierarchy in it. And it's easy for a Dutch person to say, because I think the Dutch are extremely flat in our approach, even in corporates, but it's noticeable that this is almost in all innovative younger businesses that we work with. Another interesting part is that this whole idea of the myth of the founder is much less prominent in social businesses than it is in regular startups, because the myth is also a little bit overrated. It's more about the societal cause than it is about the person, the person who's leading it. It might be still, an important factor, but I think it's really growing that we're moving past that. Another larger trend is that for most responsible or social enterprises, it's not so much a question of whether they should collaborate with the government, but rather how. Because I mean, in the end, most of them were established to address a social issue, or are at least moving in the domain that traditional government is operating in. So for them, it's quite logical to collaborate with either local, well, usually local government. And I think one nice example that has managed to do that quite well is Donkey Republic. It's a smart mobility company. They provide bike lease structures they're operating now in 71 European cities. And their approach and how they stayed ahead of their competitors is by the first thing they do when they enter a new city is talk to the municipality and ask them where does it hurt and how can we fill those gaps. And this has worked really well for them, because if you don't have that municipality buy-in, then it's very hard for you as a business to grow, because there's so much competition. And you see that in quite a lot of enterprises, that they really look for, wherever possible, to at least be in a dialogue with the local government. Another cool thing, which is pretty much, I think, global, it's not only in the agricultural sector, but beyond that, is the like some kind of revival of a cooperative. And I see this a lot in different places where you have this idea of we want to organize things together locally. This whole thing of wanting to organize locally is upcoming. Maybe also now the fact that we can't travel, it is becoming more visible, but it has been gradually happening. And I really believe that this revival of the local cooperative is something that we're going to see a lot in the time ahead. What is nice about a cooperative legal structure compared to, for instance, a foundation, is that you don't have to have a social purpose as a cooperative legally, but in practice they almost always do, because otherwise they would never have chosen for this type of organization where the shareholder, the members, let's say the stakeholders are the shareholders. And one example is that I like, I don't know how to translate, it's hard to translate it to English. It's a Dutch cooperative that is extremely successful. Herenboeren, it kind of means like gentlemen farmers. The idea is that together with 500 people, you invest in 20-hectare land and you buy a farm, you employ a farmer, and you generate your food all through the year. Every year the co-op together decides what the farmer will grow. And for €2,000 basic investment, you buy access to lifelong food. And then you pay a monthly between 25 and €50, depending on whether you also eat meat or only vegetables, and you have access to food that is totally self-grown. You can every cooperative can choose, how they want to grow it, what kind of fertilizers they want to use, and this model is literally, it's an alternative system to food creation. And anyone, you can start your own cooperative, you can join an existing one. They even calculated that if you want to purely work with this model, you only need 1/3 of the entire surface of the Netherlands, and you are, as a whole country, 100% self-sufficient, food self-sufficient. Now, of course, that's a theoretic argument. I mean, that's calculated, but let's see how that would really work. But the idea is that you pose an alternative to the existing food sector. And that is done through a cooperative. And these initiatives are growing. And you see them in Egypt as well. I think there are really cool examples, also old examples that use similar logic. Now to zoom in a couple of micro trends, and then I'll give the question, give the word back to you, Karimen. Ali specifically asked me to talk about the B Corp movement. And that is, so B Corp stands for Benefit Corporation, and it is an initiative, it's a non-profit that came from the US. But at the moment, there are over 3,000 companies worldwide operating in 71 countries in over 150 industries. And the overarching company that manages this is called B-Lab, and they certify existing businesses and they measure them according to 5 axes, like consumers, community, employers, and environment, and one more. I'll have a slide about that in a bit. And what I think is really cool is that for the first time we have a global benchmark that can measure and compare what responsible business is. And I mean, we are, as Better Future, we are also B Corp, but us being a service company, it's relatively easy to become a B Corp because we're not in agriculture, we're not far into animal farming where we have like a large CO2 footprint or. But I think the coolest B Corps are the ones that are operating in a traditionally more, environmentally challenging environment, because then it's really hard. And I highlighted a couple that I think are interesting. Yes, this is quite nice. The principle that B-Lab was established on is the idea that we are all interdependent. Is that there is nobody is not vulnerable in this economy that we're in. Everybody is codependent on the flourishing of the other. Now that's I think it's a really nice statement to contribute to. And maybe in the Netherlands, because we have a lot of B Corps, you actually see that there's quite a lot of collaboration between them. Like we, for instance, always only buy B Corp if we have unless we have another alternative. From the accountant that we hire, to the lawyer, to the food supplier, to the clothes supplier, to the notebooks that we have printed, because I think in some parts of Europe, it's you can almost buy everything B Corp now, almost. A couple highlighted, and you can find all of this on their website. They have quite a nice directory. You can search per country, per industry. You find a lot there. You will find that there are hardly any in the Middle East. So if you want to be the first, you can be the first. Danone is the only registered one in Egypt, but it's originally French. But they did have to go through quite a strong certification process in order to get there, especially being the size that they are. So a cool one, I think, is Patagonia. You might know them from the outdoor clothing that they provide, and bags and jackets and shoes. And they are very, very activist in their approach, but they didn't start off as a B Corp. So they gradually progressed into being one of the front running businesses. And they are very, they're also focusing on this repair industry. So they say, don't buy new clothes, send them to us, we will have them repaired for you. Which the more radical they became in wanting to stop consumerism, the more successful they become, which is an interesting paradox to unpack. 4G Capital is a local capital provider, a Kenyan company. It's like similar to microcredit is part of their service package. Grayston Bakery, you might know them if you're, it's an American company. They work with an open hiring system. Anybody can apply, and it's easier for people that are, for instance, ex-inmates to get access to jobs. The Guardian became B Corp last year. I think it's a logical step for them. It's quite close to their mission. Nico is an interesting company. It's based in Los Angeles, and they want to focus on local investment. So they are a neighborhood, they call themselves the neighborhood investment company, to make sure that people can invest into property in their locality. So it's also connected to zip code. And they have a very clear social statement that they want to contribute to making sure that money is contained in the locality. Fairphone is also a Dutch company. They want to make sure that phones are reusable, modularly built, and that none of the elements, like the precious metals, all of them should be renewable. So that's one of their statements. And when you look at them technically, they might not be that different, but they have really pioneered this in a very difficult and competitive sector. Mud Jeans, they're really small, but I wanted to put them out there because they work with a social lease system. So instead of buying your clothes, you lease them. And so you pay a monthly prescription for your jeans. And if you don't like them, you bring them back, you get new ones. And I've been surprised that they, even in times of COVID, are actually not doing quite well as a business. Now, shortly to jump into one that I worked with, Solar Now. They're based in Uganda and Kenya. They are really growing quite fast, and they have, when you look on the website, you can see the impact score of each B Corp. Every 2 years, a B Corp has to do a recertification. And the benchmark of being, or the threshold of becoming B Corp is, as you see, 80. And that threshold has been going up. As companies have become more progressive, what was required to become a B Corp 8 years ago is not the same anymore. So they adjusted according to how fast companies develop. And you see that they're scored on governance, workers, community, environment, and customers. And you can compensate points actually if you are not doing very well on the environment, but you have a beautiful, very rare ownership model, for instance, in the workers section. So this is one example. And what I also like is that they take context into consideration. So we used to hear the argument, yes, but we're operating in Uganda and it's a very polluted sector, or people don't understand what we're doing. That is actually corrected for in the certification measurement. And I'm a little bit critical of the way they do the assessments, because I do our own assessments as well. It really takes some time, even for a service company. But it's once you get the hang of it, it's not that difficult. It just takes a lot of patience. Now, a few things, and then I'll shut up and open the floor. But I think one thing that we see that's a huge risk at this moment in times of COVID is that there's a really clear trade-off between sustainability and safety. And I see that a lot of responsible or social businesses are struggling with that. That they're really pushing for sustainability, but actually, especially in the food sector, safety is topping everything. And as much as that is totally understandable and necessary, it also doesn't have to be as much of a trade-off as we make it look to be. So that is something to really be wary of, because we should not lose this off the agenda, actually. This is exactly the time now to keep pushing for sustainability being one of the most important points on the agenda. Another point that I see now happening that also our clients are actually facing is the question of how much data gathering is too much. And you know, now that there's less of a critical viewpoint of what is ethical in terms of data gathering. Also, now that there are some emergency decrees that some countries are pushing through, what is ethical in that sense? And that is an important one to keep in mind, because that is what COVID is accelerating, that we're less critical to that. Also, again, for the sake of safety. Another part is that I think what is visible is that the difference between operating in a high trust or a low trust cultural environment makes a huge difference for what type of businesses can make it. And that should be taken seriously, because culture matters. Having a clear social contract has an effect on the type of business model that can survive there. And that's when we deal with, for instance, our clients in Uganda or Kenya, where there is a less stable social contract. They just really struggle more than in an economy where there's a broader understanding for social impact companies. And another thing, like what I really think is a hopeful observation in this time is that the discrepancy between decision makers and influencers is becoming so visible, that the people in companies that are agile enough, that can deal with changes really fast, that might not be the formal decision makers, but they actually are the ones that can move fast, that they are also recognized for the natural leadership that they show. And we see that actually in one of our clothes brands that we work with, is that they are even changing their decision-making structures to accommodate for the natural leadership that is emerging, which is the influencers that can deal with this period of flux really well. And I think I should give the floor back to anyone who has questions or comments.
Okay, thank you, Daria. We can let the audience sort of send their questions. In the meantime, I have a few comments. Some of them I'm trying to sort of tie what you've said with previous webinars we had. You're stressing, for example, the point of the importance of purpose. Last week we had purpose of the corporation. Last week we had Colin Mayer, and he was highlighting this topic, and he was actually in a different way talking about that it should not be just a flashy motto or something. It should actually be very specific, that it will guide the strategy and the operation of a company, and it should have a clear reason for existence, and that has to tie with society at large. So this is one comment. The other interesting comment, when you're talking about cultures and customs and habits, it just dawned on me when I look at companies operating in base of the pyramid lately, they don't get marketing research companies. They get ethnographers. Now, an ethnographer would do, it's basically anthropology, and they study the people, the cultures, the customs, the habits, and the mutual differences in a community.
Yeah.
That stresses what you're saying. It's about culture and context. And a market research, a panel test is not going to get you this kind of an info. Yeah. So I think this is a type of a mind shift that has to happen. Another interesting thing which ties with things that we had before, we're going to have in the future, we talked about cooperatives. Most of what you're trying to do, you're trying to build bottom up. You're trying to sort of lend support to the masses, to the base of the pyramid. When you start doing this, a very important concept emerges, which is called governance. One of the reasons cooperatives did not operate in Egypt well is because of governance. They became actually synonym with corruption for whatever reasons, historical reasons. Now that could actually be mitigated by a better governance model. Now there is always a question that's going to come all the time, which is many people, when they do claim they're going to be responsible, what they're really doing is that they're doing no harm. There are many companies for chocolates, for example. The way they deal with slavery and supply chains is that they do not deal with the suppliers that have slavery in it. They avoid them. I mean, as long as it exists, it doesn't exist, it doesn't matter for them. They don't give it them. All what they care about from a risk perspective, it better not be in my supply chain. Or maybe I could say it even, it better be hidden down in my supply chain so no auditor can find it.
Yeah.
It's very different than a mindset where you talk about doing good. To do good, you have to invoke with the society. You have to understand what the needs are. It's more humbling than the other one. The other one is top bottom. The other one is
easy to just eradicate it from your supply chain so you don't get into trouble, but it's harder to actually go over and at least sleep over in a farmer's house for 24 hours. You'll talk differently. Yeah.
Yes, I know. But most people in corporate do not have this mindset. They live in a bubble.
Yeah.
Even the people who graduate from business school, we graduate them in a bubble, and it propagates. I mean, at some point we'd have to sort of break it. But anyway, those are my comments. I want to switch to Carmen. I just want to get the permission from the audience. We will probably extend for another 5-10 minutes if you don't mind, and if Daria don't mind. Is that okay?
Yeah.
We can do an extra 5 or 10 minutes just to sort of see what questions we can get. Kariman, floor is yours, my dear.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. Thank you so much, Daria. That was very insightful. Question. The combination of health, safety, and economic risks creates a very conducive environment for exploitation, human trafficking, and modern slavery. And this usually happens at the very nth tier of the supply chain. Could you please talk a bit about alternative practical ways by which businesses can better understand the human rights risks in their supply chains?
Yeah, I think so. One example of Ecom Ghana that I mentioned, they're a client of ours. So they have focused on, they see their supply chain being, the sustainability of their supply chain being threatened because farmers are deciding to cut down cocoa and coffee trees because it's no longer profitable. And they were like, if we don't step in and become part of the solution of the lives of our farmers, then we'll be out of business. So like we took them in a really, really intensive trip to really start to listen to the local community. We took the CEO and we said, you need to sleep over in a farmer's house, stay with them for 24 hours. And ask them all the questions you want to ask. And based on that experience, the whole leadership team had to do that. And from those conversations, we start to build on strategies. And we want in those strategy meetings to have 1 or 2 farmers, to 1 or 2 middlemen, 1 or 2 traders that are managing the relationship between farmers and middlemen. Because if you don't have that in the room, it's useless. Like I think what you said before, that it's so easy to stay in your bubble. You need to take people out of that bubble and really confront them with the humans that are actually doing the work. Because they are humans, they have usually really know what they're doing and why they're doing it. Nobody ever asks them what they need. So when you ask them what you need, it's easier to come up with solutions that actually serve them. And yeah, you can call that, respecting their human rights. I think that's sometimes language that really helps. But in the basis, it's about how do you get these people out of absolute poverty? Do they need to pay in installments so they can actually account for their school fees for their children? Do they need to work with intercrops and maybe sell them for another price? Do they need bicycles so they can transport their goods? Like, what do they really need? And they will tell you what they need. I don't know if this is an answer to your question, but dialogue and not being scared to lose your, like, step out of your bubble and maybe feel uncomfortable while you're dealing with people that you otherwise would never speak to. Like, that's okay. Is that an answer to your question?
Kariman, you need to unmute, my dear.
Yeah, thank you so much. How do you low trust ones? Can you hear me?
Now I can again. Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I think the internet connection is not friendly.
Okay. How do you describe high trust societies and low trust ones? And if you can give examples.
So, I mean, there is some academic research into that I don't have lying here, but I know that.
Okay. Another question. Okay. From your own hands-on experience, some argue that. Daria, can you hear me?
Yeah, sort of. Should I answer the first question?
Okay. Should I repeat the question?
No, I hear you.
I think I should, right?
Yeah. So I think when there's how I describe high trust and low trust is when there's basic trust in institutions and there's a clear social contract in which I think what Dr. Ali said about also the lack of corruption, the trust that you can make a deal with your neighbor and not about investment, and that will be followed through. That there's a clear governance structure that's been proven over time to work. In those societies, it's much easier to innovate with new financial models. And I mean, I think what I've seen in Egypt is that it's very hard as a social entrepreneur. You're facing a lot of governance issues. Also, I think a lot of cynicism in a way about what works and what doesn't work, because corruption is just a risk. It's just I mean, corruption to some extent I think is happening everywhere, but there are degrees. And what I noticed myself in Egypt is that it's generally quite a low trust environment. I think Uganda is also an example of quite a low trust country because, yeah, they've been facing hardship for generations. I think to a certain extent in the US also there's quite a lot of distrust systemically in the way that people collaborate, because the polarization is just huge. I don't know if that's.
Yes, thank you so much, Daria. Okay, the other question, haven't talked about the B Corps. From your hands-on experience, we would love to hear your views about some criticism to B Corps. Some argue that its ability to structurally change the status quo is a bit overrated. I'll give you an example. In his book, Winners Take All, Anand asked whether B Corps are just another elite charity for changing the world. His point is that the over-celebration of B Corps might give the impression that the way to salvation is in the market and just the market. And hence, there is no need to revisit the rules of the games, like restructuring corporate and personal income tax, allow unions, democratizing supply chains, things like that. Could it be like, with good intentions, they could actually be protecting a flawed system that the B Corps themselves wish to change? What do you think?
I think he has a very, very, very fair point. And I mean, at this moment in time, we are operating in an extremely economized economy. everything has to be market based. Everything has to, like, the market has to have the solution for everything. And I think he's right that that's a big risk. And for sure, B Corps are definitely not the answer. I think it's good to have some kind of global benchmark that can measure, that you at least know that there is a basic threshold to which they can be held accountable. But I think you're right, like it should not be overrated that, to be honest, like the effect that a large corporate can have when they even restructure to a minor level is far larger than most of the B Corps that are just relatively small. Plus, and I hope that this is happening now in the times of COVID, is that there is also reappreciation of government services. That we see that some of the countries that are dealing with COVID quite well, they have functioning institutions. And that even more of let's say the right wing, parts of those countries are even reevaluating that maybe we do need the government to restructure, and maybe we do need less market and more, less privatization, basically. So I think it's very important to be critical of the larger flow of things. I just think B Corps are a great micro example, or let's say a bottom-up movement that definitely contributes to clarity in the market, but it's not leading us to any kind of salvation. Plus, to be honest, I personally don't really care whether you are a B Corp or not, as long as you are really contributing to your local environment and you're critical of what that means.
Yeah, thank you, Seth. Thank you so much, Dr. Ali. If you can wrap up.
Sure. Daria, it's a pleasure. Thank you. Thanks a lot. It's been very informative. Always a pleasure to see somebody with a practical field experience. It shows. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting.
Pleasure. Thank you, Kariman. Thank you, Iman. Thank you, audience, for hanging in with us after the hour. Tomorrow we're going to have an interesting webinar. It's about the landscape of large-scale African giving and the COVID-19 era. It's from two folks from Bridgespan Group, which is a consulting company focusing on philanthropy and civil society. We're going to have Jan Schwer he's a partner, and Maddie Holland. He's a case team leader. Tomorrow is going to be at 3 o'clock. So stay tuned and see you soon, inshallah. Thank you. Thank you again, Daria.
Thank you. And good luck.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye for all.
Bye.